As a member of the Chowan University Department of History, it's my pleasure to welcome our speaker tonight. Rob Garnett was born in Gloucester, Virginia. He earned a bachelor's degree in English from Christopher Newport University and a master's degree also in English from Old Dominion University. Over the past 8 years, he has taught composition and literature at a number of Virginia community colleges and at Christopher Newport, where he teaches a class which focuses on Walt Whitman's Civil War poetry. The presentation that he'll make tonight is the product of his lifelong interest in history, specifically the history of the U.S. Civil War. The lecture, entitled Civil War Prison Camps, An Ancestor at Hellmira, explores the life, death, and legacy of the speaker's great-great-great-great-grandfather, I get that right? Robert Henry Gwynn. Gwynn was a resident of Gloucester, and at the outbreak of the Civil War, he enlisted in the 26th Virginia Volunteer Infantry, where he served until he was captured during the Richmond-Petersburg Campaign later in the war. In December of 1864, Gwynn died at Elmira, New York, at the infamous Union-operated prison camp. Please join me in welcoming our speaker for tonight, Rob Garnett.
Good evening. Before I begin my presentation, I'd like to thank everybody for their attendance today. And I'd also like to thank Warren Chauncey and everyone here at Chowan that organized this lecture and made it possible. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you. My presentation tonight is entitled Civil War Prison Camps, An Ancestor at Hellmira, and I will explore my fourth great grandfather's life, death, and legacy. I'll start with a genealogical chart, and I have the clock there turning back the hands of time. Here I am at the bottom of this family tree. Then you move on to my parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, and once we get to my great-grandfather, we follow his side of the family tree and go back and back until we reach Robert Henry Gwynn, born in 1827 and dying on December 26, 1864 in the Elmira Prison Camp. I have to mention my grandmother in all of this. As you can see, she was born in the 1930s, and a lot of the information that I started with came from her. She was told stories first and second hand about the Civil War. Several years ago, she told me that we had an ancestor who died in Elmira, and that started me on this research journey. So I have to thank her as well for inspiring me to pursue this work. Here's a picture of Patrick Henry Gwynn. He was Robert Gwynn's son. I haven't been able to find a photo of Robert yet, but that's his son. So I think that can give you a fair idea of what he may have looked like. Robert Henry Gwynn was born in 1827 in Matthews County. By the 1850s, according to the federal census, he had relocated to Gloucester County, which is the adjacent county, and he had married Elizabeth Booker. And his occupation is listed as a farmer. So like most men of his time, he was a small yeoman farmer. In the 1860 census, they list 4 children, Patrick, age 10, Robert, 3, Franklin, 1, and a girl, Indiana, 2 months old. By that time, Elizabeth disappears from the census, so I wonder if she died from childbirth complications, like many women of her era. You can see that she had 3 children in close succession there. I found a book that contained marriage records of Gloucester County, and in that book I uncovered this dramatic detail. Robert Henry Gwynn remarried Adeline. He remarried to Adeline Bridges on April 11th, 1861, and that was the day before the Civil War began, the day before the Fort Sumter bombardment. So it's very kind of heart-wrenching to me to imagine this couple getting married and then the Civil War erupting and pulling them apart. Less than a month after his marriage, on May 8th, Gwynn enlisted in Company B of the 26th Virginia Volunteer Infantry. And you hear a lot of terms when it comes to Civil War organization, divisions, companies, corps, etc. Regiment is comprised of 1,000 men from the same area. So it wasn't unusual for brothers, nephews, cousins, uncles to all be in the same unit. It just so happens that I have 3 more ancestors in the same regiment. John Allen, my 3rd great-grandfather, and his 2 sons, who were 18 and 16, they would be my 4th great uncles. So all of them were in the regiment together. This promoted unit cohesion. Men tended to stand firmer in battle when they were shoulder to shoulder with a relative or a neighbor. But as you can imagine, for example, during Pickett's charge, all the men in a town could be wiped out in a single engagement. So in some cases, it had a terrible effect on their communities back home. The history of the 26th is rather unusual. For the first 3 years of the war, they didn't see any significant action. They were garrisoned at Gloucester Point, which is at the mouth of the York River. Very strategic, important to the Union Army. They were sent there to support naval batteries. They were also deployed around Richmond during the 7 days, which took place in 1862. Robert E. Lee threw the Union Army back from the gates of Richmond. It was a very bloody conflict, but the 26th wasn't engaged. They were left in support, and they never saw any fighting. Then they were sent to Charleston, South Carolina, to defend the forts in that state. So during the Antietam campaign, Gettysburg, all of these horrible, bloody battles, the 26th remained out of harm's way. That changed in 1864. Before then, though, Gwynn was promoted to corporal, so he must have been a capable soldier. Typically, the men who were a little older and showed some leadership qualities were promoted. When we hit the spring of 1864, you have the Overland Campaign, and that is when Grant is designated General-in-Chief. He comes from the West, where he's been very successful, and he meets Robert E. Lee in the East. And that was a terrible series of battles that took place over about 6 or 7 weeks. 80,000 casualties during that time. Grant and Lee really go at each other. The 26th was recalled to Virginia, and by June 15th, 1864, they had entrenched at Petersburg, which is about 20 miles south of Richmond. Grant knew that if he was able to take Petersburg, the Confederate capital would fall. Petersburg was a railroad, transportation, and manufacturing hub. It was critical to the South's war aims. So the 26th entrenched in Petersburg, and they repulsed numerous Union assaults. For a while, they were very successful. They were very stubborn in their entrenchments, beat the Union Army back several times, but eventually they were overrun. The Union Army initiates a nighttime attack, and they spread their lines out, and they're able to overrun a place called Battery 5. That was the fort where the 26th was deployed. Gwynn was captured along with many other of his compatriots, and he was sent to Point Lookout, Maryland. He was then transferred to Elmira because Union officials feared that Point Lookout was vulnerable to a sea attack, and also there were some Confederate units in the area. nearby. So for safety reasons, and also due to overcrowding, many prisoners at Point Lookout were transferred to Elmira. Here's a picture of Battery 5 today. The Petersburg National Battlefield has preserved a few of the batteries, and Battery 5 is one of them. So this is where Gwynn was captured. It's interesting and powerful for me to go back to these sites and stand where he stood and imagine what he experienced. A few words on Grant, Lincoln, and prisoners of war. It's important to keep in mind that hardly anyone was prepared for the length or magnitude of the war. The vast majority of people, politicians, generals, the general citizenry, they thought that the Civil War would be over rather quickly. After a big battle or two, people would come to their senses and one side would quit. We know now that certainly wasn't the case. 4 years long, and it consumed 750,000 lives. And to put that into a modern day perspective, that would be 7.5 million people today. Our population is 10 times today what it was during the 1860s. So if you can imagine, 7.5 million people dead. In the beginning of the war, prisoners of war were quickly exchanged or paroled. If the Confederates had captured 100 Union soldiers, the Union had captured 100 Confederates, they would simply trade. They didn't want vast numbers of prisoners on their hands because, of course, you have to transport them, shelter them, feed them. They didn't want to spend the money and the time to care for all of these prisoners. If there were prisoners left over from the exchange, they were paroled. They were given documentation and sent home, and they weren't supposed to become engaged in the war again until they could be exchanged. So that was the system for the first few years. But by the spring of 1865, the North, Lincoln, Grant, they decide to prosecute a hard war. They halt the prison exchange system for a few reasons. One, there were suspicions that paroled Confederates rejoined their ranks, and of course that benefits the smaller army. So Grant had a problem with that, obviously. The Confederacy also refused to exchange black soldiers. That was the Confederate government's stance. By 1863, African American troops were serving in the Union ranks, and if captured, the Confederate government was not willing to exchange them for white soldiers. There was also the issue of manpower. A war of attrition favored the North. They outnumbered the South in terms of men and material drastically. So Grant and Lincoln realized all of this and decide to stop the prison exchange. And here's a quote directly from Grant, which demonstrates his chilling logic, his terrible arithmetic. If we commence a system of exchange which liberates all prisoners taken, we will have to fight on until the whole South is exterminated. If we hold those caught, they amount to no more than dead men. So he's doing the math in his head, and he figures that if we stop this exchange system, it will abbreviate the war and turn it into the North's favor. A few other things to consider. I pose the question, is it forgivable to doom 56,000 soldiers to slow deaths in POW camps? In terms of each side, the Confederates held many hundreds of thousands of Union prisoners. About 30,000 perished. In the Union-run prisons, about 25,000 Confederates perished. So altogether, 56,000 casualties as a direct cause of these prison camps. A statistic that caught my eye, prison was 3 times more fatal than the battlefield. So your chances were better if you were fighting, if you were actively campaigning, as opposed to being tossed into these horrible prison camps. So this is a startling number, and I wonder if it was worth it. Do we give Lincoln a pass here? Should we be more critical of him? They certainly were. During his time in September 1864, a group of clergymen and physicians congregated at the White House, and they begged Lincoln to rescind Grant's order. Please resume the prison exchanges. And he refused to do so. They even called it simple murder. How can you turn your back on your own soldiers and allow them to die in these awful camps? No documentation exists that demonstrates Lincoln's objection to this idea. So he was very complicit in Grant's order. And I find it kind of ironic. We typically associate Lincoln with freedom, liberty. He's renowned as the great emancipator, but he did allow tens of thousands of men to die in these camps. Even Walt Whitman, here's a literature connection. Walt Whitman, he wrote, "O Captain, My Captain," you've probably read that at some point, and several other poems dedicated to Lincoln. He admired Lincoln a great deal. They would see each other in Washington, D.C., and bow and greet one another. But even Whitman was appalled by the president's lack of action on this point. Whitman's brother, George Washington Whitman, was also captured near Petersburg, and he was held at the infamous Libby prison in Richmond. Here is a county breakdown of New York State. The Elmira Prison Camp is located in Chemung County, which is right across the border from Pennsylvania. I went there to visit and do some more research last spring. It's about an 8-hour drive from Williamsburg, Virginia to Elmira, New York. And here's a picture of the prison camp. A few things that I'll point out. You can see the stockade here. It was a 12-foot wall constructed in a rectangle around the prison. The prison was roughly 40 acres, to give you some dimensions. And the tents in the foreground are significant. You can see the barracks in the back there. Those are the buildings that would have housed the soldiers. But during the fall and winter of 1864, the overcrowding resulted in this. Many tents pitched to shelter these prisoners as opposed to barracks. So if you can imagine being a soldier from Florida or Georgia, Mississippi, being captured, sent north to Elmira, and having to deal with the frigid fall and winter, it was a terrible ordeal. And in the accounts that I read, at one point it got down to negative 18 degrees, bone chilling cold. And on a personal note, when I went to Elmira in May, it was still chilly. I had to wear a sweat coat the entire time. So the climates are dramatically different between Virginia, North Carolina, and New York. I read several books that dealt extensively with the topic of Elmira, and there's one book that really goes after the Union retaliation policy. They view it, Michael Horrigan, author, views it as a deliberate death camp. This camp was set up to expedite soldiers' deaths. It was an operation from July 1864 to July 1865, so 1 full year. During that time, about 3,000 of the 12,000 prisoners perished, for a rate of 24.3% to be precise, and that was the highest rate of any northern POW camp, so it was the worst place to be sent if you were a Confederate POW, and an average of 8 deaths per day during its year of operation. There's some compelling evidence to support the retaliation policy here. It was intentionally overcrowded. Union officers at the camp were in close communication with Union officials in D.C., and they estimated that the camp could only hold about 5,000 prisoners. 10,000 were sent instead, so almost immediately the camp was terribly overcrowded. There was also a pond located within the stockade. It's called Foster's Pond, and for some reason it remained undrained. And when you have thousands of men in the vicinity, that pond becomes stagnant, filthy, it spreads disease, and it even tainted the water table. It ruined the drinking water in the area. Exposure. I mentioned a moment ago about the barracks. They were insufficient, and thousands of men had to crowd in the tents. Malnutrition in an area of plenty. If you look at the newspaper accounts from Chemung County at that time, they're boasting about the apple and the wheat harvests, how much food they've been able to cultivate, but very little of that food made its way into the camp. The prisoners subsisted on half rations. Private food purchases were also banned for a time. There was a merchant that they called a sutler. He would visit the camp and sell food and other items. That practice was abolished. And care packages from home were restricted only to the sick. So if you were a friend or family member, most likely your package would not get to your loved one in the camp. 1/4 of the camp's budget was returned after the war. So the officers were very frugal. They pinched a lot of pennies, and at the end of the war, they sent a large chunk of the money back. Many critics look at this and they say, well, this is money that could have gone towards extra food, medical supplies, building materials, things like that. Why was so much money left over after the war? Here's a chart that I pulled from another interesting book. I highly recommend this if you're interested in the topic. Andersonville's of the North by James Gillespie. And he tries to take a more even-handed approach to this topic. You have kind of radical authors on each side, and he takes a more even-handed approach. And even by his estimation, the officers, the officials involved in Elmira were at the very least incompetent. As you can see, Elmira ranked as the worst of the camps. I believe these are the 9 major Union camps here, Point Lookout and Elmira at the bottom. So drastically different figures here, and that begs the question, why? Many people, many scholars, historians, experts believe that Elmira was a deliberate death camp. Woodlawn Cemetery in Elmira is close by to the Elmira Prison Camp. The soldiers that died were buried there, and you can see all of the gravestones here. It's kind of overwhelming to stand back and look at it all. About 3,000 Confederate soldiers buried here. Off to the right, there's also a Union section, and Mark Twain is buried up on the hill here. So I also took a look at his gravesite, and this is a personal photo that I took. There are 2 monuments in the cemetery of note. One is a monument erected by the United Daughters of the Confederacy, and that's just in memoriam to the soldiers that died at the camp. And an interesting story behind this monument, it's meant to represent the lives lost during the Shohala train crash. When prisoners were sent from Point Lookout to Elmira, that train load of prisoners collided with a coal train on the tracks, and it killed 49 soldiers on the southern side and about 17 on the Union. And among all those graves, I managed to find my 4th great-grandfather, Robert Henry Gwynn, Company B, 26th Virginia Regiment. He died of dysentery on December 26, 1864, the day after Christmas, which is rather sad, but also just a few weeks before the North recommenced the exchange system. By January, February 1865, Atlanta has fallen, Lincoln's been re-elected, Lee is pinned down at Petersburg and Richmond, and the North can see the end of the war in sight. So they begin the exchange system once again, but Gwynn died before he could be exchanged. So I hope that this material is interesting, but it is 150, 60 years old. A question that we have to pose to ourselves is, how is it relevant today? There is a controversial legacy to consider here. As all of you know, Confederate landmarks, monuments have been the subject of intense debate lately. This is a picture of Gloucester's Confederate monument. You can find it in the Courthouse, and that was erected in 1889. Approximately 1,000 Gloucester men served during the Civil War, and of that number, 132 are confirmed dead, and their names appear on these granite plaques on each face of the monument. And you can find R.H. Gwynn also included on that list. A few points on the preservation of Confederate monuments. You have to consider the cost of removal. Obviously, many of these monuments are very large and heavy. It requires a lot of work to disassemble, transport, and place somewhere else. And most of the time, this is funded by taxpayer dollars. And when polled in private, about 2/3 of the public objects to the removal of these monuments. The slippery slope, who's next? If you start with Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, etc., these Confederate monuments, where does it end? There have been calls to discontinue funding or public funding to the Jefferson Memorial in Washington, D.C. In many parks across the country, there are statues of George Washington. Should they be removed? Some people think they should. The timing. When you are discussing this topic, many people will point to the timing of these monuments when they're put up. They appear 40, 50, 60 years after the Civil War. And some would argue, well, they represent the Jim Crow era in the South. This was white America at the time, their attempt to remind people who was in charge. But there's a simpler explanation for it. 40, 50, 60 years after the war, that's when most of the Civil War veterans were dying off. If you were a young man who fought in the war, by that time you were in your 70s, 80s, and passing away. And of course, their family members wanted to commemorate their service and place these monuments to their memory. Racism is something that should be addressed head on. Don't shy from it. When you are discussing Confederate-related topics, this is a point that arises quite a bit. Lee was a racist, the Confederate flag is racist, so on and so forth. It's important to judge people within their historical context. During the 1850s and 60s, racism was rampant, unfortunately, North and South. If you look at some of the things Abraham Lincoln said, the great emancipator, they're shocking to us today because we're viewing the 1860s through a 2019 lens. That is a logical fallacy called presentism. You can't pass judgment on people according to your modern sensibilities. And I'm sure we would hope for the same thing. 100 years, 150 years after our time, do we want our descendants attacking us unfairly? There's also the educational value to consider. Instead of sanitizing history or censoring it somehow, research, do a lot of reading and thinking, hold discussions, and arrive at some compromise. For example, at Charlottesville, they maintained the Lee statue, but they renamed the park. I think that's a fair compromise and satisfies a lot of people. There are some teachers who are hesitant to talk about the Civil War in their classes because it's so controversial. Instead of shying from it, learn about it and arrive at some sort of agreement. Personally, I feel much smarter, much more fulfilled after doing years of research on this topic. The purpose of these monuments, specifically the Gloucester Monument, on the monument you'll see the words vacant grave, place the fair column over the vacant grave, a soldier's honor let a soldier have. And another word that I was unfamiliar with in one of the commencement speeches, cenotaph. I had to look that up. I had never heard it before. A cenotaph is an empty grave. This monument, quite simply, served as a headstone. If your ancestor, if your family member is buried in New York, 8 hours away from Gloucester County by car, and you can imagine immediately after the Civil War, transportation just wasn't readily available. Where can you go to remember them and honor their service? This monument served that purpose to friends and family after the war. Virginia's motive for secession, when I was in high school and when I was in college, nobody tipped me off to this fact here. It's important to keep in mind that each state left the Union separately for its own reasons. The Deep South does secede due to their concern that Lincoln will put slavery on the pathway to extinction. But then you have the Fort Sumter crisis to consider. After that incident, Lincoln calls for 75,000 troops with the condition that each state remaining in the Union contribute to that number. And that is when Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas break away from the Union. Basically, Virginia and those other three states, they refused to invade their sister states. They would not send their soldiers into other states to impose Lincoln's will. And Lincoln was very unpopular. We admire him today. Very few Lincoln critics out there, but in 1860, he received 39.8% of the popular vote. He won the election due to the Electoral College, very unpopular during his time. In 1864, he won only 55% of the vote in the North. The South did not vote during that election. So you have to wonder, why was he so unpopular? And this is one of the reasons here. Some people argue that he may have provoked the Civil War unnecessarily. And he certainly drove Virginia and the upper southern states out of the Union. So I include a list of my works cited in case anybody wants to do their own research, and I encourage you to do that. I can give you some book suggestions here. All of these facts are well documented, and do your own reading. And at this point, I'll take any questions or comments that you have. Thank you for your attention. Thank you.